We move now to a discussion of the person of the Father in Thomas's Trinitarian theology. And in the previous lecture, we talked about the Trinitarian processions. We talked about the nature of procession. We talked about the distinguishing characteristics of the Son and the Spirit as they proceed, the Son in generation, the Spirit inspiration. We talked about the cycle of the processions, but we didn't talk about the Father, because the Father does not proceed. Hence, we need to take time now in a more systematic way to talk about the Trinitarian persons in the full ordering of their relations. And Thomas speaks of the Father, this is the initial and primary point, as the principle of the processions, we'll define that, and the source of deity for the Son and the Holy Spirit, and hence the source for the unity of the essence in the Godhead. If you are familiar with traditional Reformed theology, this is going to be a different discussion in a number of ways, particularly when we see the way it applies to the exitus and reditus of the creature. But now, Thomas says in ST1, question 40, answer 2, that the name Father signifies not just a property, but the person itself. And the reason is that the Father signifies the relation that is distinctive and constitutive of his hypostasis. The relation to which the name Father points is a subsisting person. And so the Father initially contains within himself and subsists as the entire divine essence. As a subsisting person, if we can put it this way, he natively possesses the entire and undifferentiated and non-preceding divine essence. And the unique personal property of the Father is the fact that the Father is unbegotten. Or Thomas likes to speak of him also as unengendered. Now, Thomas spends quite a bit of time clarifying what it means for the Father to be unbegotten, as he is the principle of the Trinitarian processions and the source of deity for the unity of essence within the Godhead. The source of the deity for the Son and Spirit, and the source of the unity of the essence. Gilles Emery, on page 156 of Trinitarian Theology of Thomas Aquinas, summarizes this cluster of conceptions that we're about to unpack analytically in the following way. The Father as Father thus communicates to his Son the whole treasury of divinity, except for the fact of being Father, which precisely indicates his relation to the Son. In the Summa Theologiae, Thomas sums up all the elements of his biblical exegesis in the more formal statement that paternity signifies the Father's, quote, relation of principle towards the Son. The relation of principle toward the Son. And I'm going to put that here. Relation of principle toward the Son. Now that's a critical thing to note, and we're going to unpack it. As the Father is unbegotten, he is the relation of principle toward the Son. And these two terms, unbegotten and the language of relation of principle, becomes a kind of conceptual way of talking about the Father in relation to the Son. Now, what is a principle? A principle, which we defined earlier, is a reality from which something proceeds. So it's a point of origin. Thomas means by principle that the Father is the principle of the Son, precisely as he, quote, communicates to the Son the whole treasury of divinity. And so the way that the Father is unbegotten, the way he is the relation of principle toward the Son, is by way of communicating the whole divine to the Son. Thomas is quite clear about the meaning then of the term principle. He says, without specifying how the origination happens, the name principle means an order of origin. That's from his commentary on the sentences. When applied to the action of filiation, that is, when applied to that intellective action of the Father, whereby the Son is begotten of the Father, principle denotes the action of the Father from which the Son proceeds. So, if the Father is the principle of the Son, he is the one from whom the Son proceeds, both in his person and in his divinity. Emery is very helpful as he elaborates on this. And this is a helpful summary. Listen. He says the language by, this is Trinitarian Theology of Thomas Aquinas, page 159. He says the language by which we refer to the Father as principle can be further enriched by other names. Later on, our investigation of unbegottenness will bring out the Augustinian terms principle without principle, principle of divinity, and other expressions coming from the Greek fathers. For the moment, we will mention the word source, fons, which St. Thomas took mainly from pseudo-Dionysian category. It's a Dionysian category. He borrowed it from pseudo-Dionysius. That Thomas took mainly from Pseudo-Denis, but also from Athanasius and Cyril of Alexandria. The language of originary plenitude is more common in the commentary on the sentences, but one also finds it in the Summa. St. Thomas can easily take this on board by connecting the name to the foregoing analysis. The Father is named source under his aspect of principle without principle. Now, pause and reflect on this because this is critical. Inherited from the patristics, and particularly the pseudo-Dionysian tradition, Thomas speaks of the Father as the source of deity, the originary plenitude of the eternal Son. That means at least these things. The Father communicates deity to the Son. The Father's deity is native. The Son's deity is derived by way of communication. A second way to put this, the Father is the principle of divinity for the Son. Thomas believes that the Father communicates person and deity in the act of eternal generation. And he has no problem, while not speaking of the Son as a creature, at the same time he has no problem speaking of the Father as the source of the Son's essence. The Father is the originary plenitude of the Son. Now, that sounds like Thomas believes that the Son is created, but as we saw earlier, he doesn't. But at the same time, Thomas affirms that the Father is the originating principle of the Son and the communicative source of his deity. He does not follow the Franciscan Bonaventure and the other masters who taught a hierarchy within the Trinity. Now pause for a second. What do we mean by a hierarchy in the Trinity? Let me put it very simply for the sake of rudimentary understanding. If the Father is the source of deity for the Son, and by extension, the source of deity for the Holy Spirit, along with the Son, then only the Father has native self-existence. Only the Father is a se. He has that natively. The Son and the Spirit, by extension, would have their divinity from another. It would flow to them from a communicative source in the Father. And the way that's pictured, and the Thomistic tradition will speak this way, is as a fountain from which the water emanates from source and then spills over. And in that spilling over or overflow, there is a communication of that deity to other persons, Son and Spirit. But it would be as source, Father, to receiver from source, Son and Spirit. The Son and Spirit would be receptive of deity. The Father would be productive of it. And what that does is it qualifies very extensively the sense in which the Father is a se and the sense in which the Son and the Spirit are a se. As John Calvin once said famously, derived deity does not seem to be the same as deity, communicated and derived from a source. But Thomas, though he affirms that the Son receives his deity from the Father, does not argue for a hierarchy within the Trinity, as did Bonaventure. Now listen to this. Emery, page 160. St. Bonaventure connects the universe of created hierarchies to the divine hierarchy. For the Franciscan master, this divine hierarchy consists in the perfect unity and Trinity in God, which implies an order within the communication of the good. Now let me pause on that and just expound it. If there is an ordered hierarchy in created reality, Bonaventure said there is an ordered hierarchy in uncreated reality. The Father is the source of the deity of the Son and the Spirit, the source of the good. And that hierarchical order in the Trinitarian processions is matched by a hierarchical order in the created universe. Bonaventure stepped to the plate and said that. Thomas did not. Let's continue with the quote. Back to Emery. The Dominican theologian, Thomas, is more reticent about it because the word hierarchy connotes an inequality of degrees or levels, so it is incongruous to speak of a hierarchy within the triune God. He is very firm about this. Between the divine persons, there is no priority whatsoever, neither in rank, nor in dignity, nor in any other way. The notion of principle enables one to avoid these ambiguities, and St. Thomas remains strictly attached to it. It is by means of this notion, plus the related theme of order, that he describes paternity as a personal property and the Father's unbegottenness. To be principal, Thomas says, is proper to the Father insofar as the Father is the principle of the Son through generation. End of quote. Now, I am trying, as I've noted already, to limit all criticisms of Thomas to a later module, all substantial structural criticisms. But I just want to flag this for you and make a preliminary observation. I believe that to the extent that Thomas remains consistent with his conception of the Father as principle of processions and source of deity for the Son and Holy Spirit, that he should go the route of Bonaventure, who understood the Father as originating principle and communicative source of the deity of the Son and of the Spirit, and saw that as a kind of hierarchy. If the Father is the unity of the Trinity, which Thomas affirms, and if the deity of the Son and Spirit are dependent on a prior principle or source, then it seems that hierarchy within the Trinity is incredibly difficult to avoid. This is a real difficulty that Thomas faces. How can he affirm, as Emery wants to say, no priority whatever, when he affirms the Father as the originating principle and communicative source of the deity of the Son and Spirit? I believe this has motivated Calvin and Calvinist theologians who follow him to critique Thomas precisely by calling into question this doctrine of the Father as the communicative source of the deity of other persons. It leads to that hierarchy that Bonaventure affirmed. Now, that critique must wait for a later module. It will be one of the central pillars of a Reformed alternative to Thomas, following Calvin. But that leads us to a second and related point that I'd like to talk about: the Father as the source of exitus and reditus. The Father source of exitus and reditus. If you're looking for something of structural import, this is it. Thomas is explicit that the principal source of the unity of the Godhead resides in the Father. He says this, quote, in his commentary on the sentences: "When we consider the properties of the persons, we find the notion of the Father as first principle. And it is in virtue of the unity of a principle without principle that the same nature is communicated to all within each nature, and that is why, through the Father, all is one." End of quote. The divine unity is appropriated to the Father because the Father is the principle of unity in the Trinity. If this were put in a Reformed confession, which it's not, it would be that the unity of the divine essence has its source in the Father as the font of deity. But for Thomas, the unity of form unfolds from the unity of principle, so that the consubstantial unity of the Trinity comes from the person of the Father in eternal processional relations by which he communicates his essence to the Father and the Son. Now, this is incredibly important for Thomas. The Father is originating principle and communicative source of the Son and Holy Spirit establishes what Thomas himself calls the exitus reditus scheme. And if I could put that scheme most basically, all things are from the Father, and all things return to the Father. All things from the Father, exitus. All things return to the Father, reditus. The Father is the originating principle and communicative source of all things. All things in eternal and temporal processions depart from the Father. All things in a manner appropriate to nature return to the Father in reditus. Listen to what Thomas says. And this is his commentary on the sentences. In the coming out of creatures from their first principle, exitus, one observes a certain circulation or regyration in the fact that all things take their end point of return to that which produced them as their principle. And therefore it is necessary that the return to the end come about through the same realities through which the exit from the principle was achieved. Now, let me pause that quote and comment on it. What Thomas is saying, basically, is that all things take their point of departure from a principle and source. All things return to that principle as end. So a principle is both originating source and climactic end. All things come from a principle. All things return to the principle. Exitus and reditus. What is that principle? The Father. This is the key. Picking up back the quote now. Thus, in the same way that the processions of the persons is the rationale for the production of creatures by the first principle, exitus, so likewise the procession of the persons is the rationale of this return to the end. Since in the same way that we have been created through the Son and the Holy Spirit, so likewise it is through them that we are united to the ultimate end. Now, I quoted this without the rich Trinitarian context in place in the opening lecture, but what do we now know that we didn't know then? Here it is. The Son and Spirit depart from and return to the Father in exitus and reditus. All things in the Son and Spirit depart from the Father and return to the Father in exitus and reditus. Just as the Son and the Spirit proceed and return to the Father as the source of their being, so the creatures proceed from and return to the Father in the missions of the Son and Spirit. You can call it a paternal-centric view. The structure of the eternal processions bears the same structure of the temporal processions. As the Son and Spirit depart from and return to the Father as principle without principle and source of deity, so it is with the creatures who participate in the missions of the Son and Spirit. Just so we grasp this then, the Father, not the Son and Spirit, the Father is the source of the exitus and reditus of all things, divine and human. This leads further to that conception of hierarchy, does it not? Now, just in light of this, Emery makes this comment. He says, in this discussion, the Father appears as the source and end of the whole divine economy. On the one side, the Father is the origin of all things. He is the principle of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, through whom he acts in the world. It is through the generation of the Son and by the procession of the Holy Spirit that the Father exercises his paternal action. On the other side, the Father also acts as the conclusion of the missions of the Son and the Spirit. The work of the Son and Holy Spirit consists in leading us to the Father. St. Thomas underlines the close correspondence between the outlay of the eminent mystery of God and that of the Trinitarian economy. Everything comes from the Father and everything returns to the Father. Page 174, 175, Trinitarian Theology of Thomas. The Father, therefore, anchors the exitus and reditus in Thomas's system of theology and is the principle of the processions, the communicative source of the deity of the Son and the Spirit, and the end to which all things divine and human return. You cannot understand Thomas's Trinitarian theology of exitus and reditus, Thomas's Trinitarian theology of the missions, without seeing the primary, privileged, exalted place that he gives to the Father as the communicative source of the deity of the Son and Spirit in their processions, and the communicative source and end of creatures elevated by grace to participate in those processional relations of exitus and reditus to the Father. And now we need to speak in this context more specifically about the identity of the Son of God who proceeds as such from the Father.